Thanks for joining us. My name is Simmons Buntin, and I am the editor-in-chief of Terrain.org. Good evening from Tucson, where I sit here in the traditional ancestral lands of the O'odham and the Yaqui. Thank you for joining us for what I know will be a delightful reading this evening, featuring Juan Morales, Rachel Richardson, and Simmons Buntin. That's me. It's my pleasure to welcome you and share a few announcements before I turn it over to the lovely Elizabeth Dodd, who is coming to us from a coast somewhere, I think. After the reading, we'll be sure to leave some time for Q&A as well. Hey, if your connection becomes slow, you may want to turn off your video. In all cases, please remain muted. But you're welcome to post your questions and other positive feedback in chat, and we'll probably open up the audio for Q&A at the end. Actually, when I say open it up, this is a traditional meeting, so that's why we ask you to remain muted. We are recording this reading, and we'll make it available from the Terrain.org website, as well as the Terrain.org YouTube channel shortly. So now, two quick announcements. First, the Terrain.org regular submission period for poetry, nonfiction, and fiction is now open. It closes on March 31st for poetry and on April 30th for prose, which is fiction and nonfiction in our case. Meanwhile, our Letter to America and Art Terrain Gallery submissions are open year-round, and you can learn more at terrain.org/submit. Seems like a good time to be writing or thinking about a letter to America and submitting that to us. We have several in the queue, and I'm sure we're going to get more, and rightfully so. Okay. Also, our next reading will be Monday, March 24th at 5 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, for our next online reading featuring the winners of our annual contests in poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. Those stellar contributions by Julia B. Levine, L.I. Henley, and Seth Morgan, respectively, will publish the week before the reading or thereabouts. Okay, so let's turn to tonight's reading, followed by Q&A. Elizabeth and I will be posting book links in the chat in support of our readers this evening, so keep an eye out for that. Also, be sure to post your thoughts and questions in chat as we look forward to an engaging conversation following the readings. And finally, thanks again for joining us. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Elizabeth Dodd. For over 3 decades now, Elizabeth Dodd has lived in eastern Kansas in the Flint Hills region, where she is an award-winning professor of creative writing and literature at Kansas State University. She has team-taught courses with scientists, philosophers, and historians, and has led students on field trips in conjunction with their readings in environmental literature. Elizabeth is a poet and nonfiction writer. With me and Derek Sheffield, who's also here. Thanks, Derek. She is the editor of Dear America, Letters of Hope, Habitat, Defiance, and Democracy, which I must say is more relevant than ever, which I never hope to say again, but so it goes. Her newest nonfiction book, Horizons Lens, My Time on the Turning World, was published by the University of Nebraska Press. So Elizabeth, dear, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Simmons, and thank you, everyone, for coming. What a terrific turnout we have. Thank you all for coming for the uplifting energy that comes from excellent literature. I am going to introduce each of our readers just before they read, beginning with Simmons. And yes, please do. If you have some comments or something that you want to put in the chat, I'll try to keep track of them. We'll have Q&A at the end. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to everyone tonight the man who needs no introduction, but I've got one for him anyway. Simmons Buntin is the founding editor-in-chief of Terrain.org and the president and member of the board of Terrain Publishing, which is the publishing arm that coordinates and works with the Sowell Collection for the book contest that he has been discussing. Terrain.org's parent nonprofit organization is Terrain Publishing. He has published poetry, essays, and technical articles in publications as varied as Edible Baja, Arizona, Orion Magazine, Kyoto Journal, and Bulletin of Science, Technology, and Society. He has a Master of Urban Planning and Master of Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Colorado, Denver, concluded by an award-winning thesis on sustainable suburban downtown redevelopment, and he has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Arizona. His paying gig is as Director of Marketing and Communications for the University of Arizona's College of Information Science. Simmons' newest book is Satellite, Essays on Fatherhood and Home, Near and Far, which has appeared from Trinity University Press in 2025, which Janice Ray calls a field guide to a father's love. He has won an Academy of American Poets Prize, Colorado Artists Fellowship for Poetry, and grants from the U.S. Forest Service, the Arizona Commission on the Arts, and the Tucson Pima Arts Council. His first book of poetry, Riverfall, was published in 2005, and his second, Bloom, was published in 2010, both by Ireland's Salmon Poetry. He is the editor, with me and Derek Sheffield, of Dear America. Did we mention? A collection of letters of hope, habitat, defiance, and democracy, which may be more relevant now than ever. You can catch up with him at www.simmonsbuntin.com or on his new Substack at Urban Wild. Simmons, will you please read to us?
I will, Elizabeth, thank you. And hey, it's really a pleasure to read here this evening with Juan and Rachel, whose work I admire very much. And I think they're reading poetry. I'm going to read a little nonfiction. I'm going to read excerpts of the first essay in Satellite, my new book. Although for those of you who know me, I've been working on this quite some time. It's 16 essays that have really been written over the last, 16, 17 years or thereabouts. And the essay I'm going to read this evening, or parts of it, is called The Sum of All Species. And so I'm just going to get into that, and I'll wear my Albus Dumbledore glasses to read that. That our house is filled with lizards is the result both of chance and circumstance. That geckos smaller than a finger come out at night, scouring the baseboards without a sound. They enter, I suspect, through a small gap in the weather stripping beneath our front door. Perhaps they follow less desirable critters. So far, they are tidy, amiable housemates that give us good reason to avoid pesticides. Other lizards come in, too. Outside, the sun-dappled yard bristles with a sudden scrambling of whiptail lizards, their body-length stripes providing odd camouflage among lantana and sage. Given my 10-year-old daughter Annalise's affinity for tracking small animals, she soon catches a young specimen, which she subdues by stroking its head and body. Within minutes, it comfortably scales her hand and arm, weaving through her hair, never trying, or at least succeeding, in escape. Escape is not a part of my daughter's plans. It rarely is. In the 7 years we've lived in the master planned community of Sabano in southeast Tucson, a pell-mell pile of plastic bug jars, terrariums, and butterfly baskets has found a permanent home in our garage. None are used lightly. After summer rainstorms, Annalise and her 7-year-old sister Juliet raced to the temporary ponds at the end of our street to collect tadpoles, scooping the rainwater and savoring the cloudy concoction with its teeming polywogs as if it were a succulent stew. When the girls return home, they place a rock in the stained and shallow box so that, as the water evaporates, the morphing tadpoles can crawl from the water. The girls have no intention of returning the tadpoles to the ponds, both because the thirsty ground drinks the ponds down, and because the excitement is in watching them become frogs, or die trying. Annalise's excitement about the whiptail is evident not only in the new home she has created in the largest of the portable terrariums, sand substrate, choya skeleton, sprig of tuberosa, but in the way she carries the lizard throughout the day. They are inseparable, and any hopes of regular hand washing after handling the reptile, what with pet store warnings of salmonella, are lost in the first hour of their acquaintance. Initially, I encourage her to return the lizard to the wild. It's wild anyway, for our yard is not so much wild as it is purposefully tangled, with layers of prickly pear, Mexican bird of paradise, and desert willow. How else to attract and admire the family of quail at sunrise, the comical cactus wrens at the other end of the day? But I can only relent, both in the knowledge that she has wanted and asked for a pet lizard for years, and because at that age I had collected and kept my own community of desert critters, from centipedes to scorpions, field mice to king snakes. Now fast forward here a little bit. Annalise waits eagerly for me as I return from work. Squeaky, the name she gives the whiptail, is curled beneath a smooth rock in the terrarium. Soon we'll be on our way to the local pet store for the essentials, which we're vague on but undoubtedly include food and some device to warm the cold-blooded reptile. Before we depart, however, I urge my daughter to learn a bit more about the lizard to ensure that we can, in fact, meet its needs as a pet. Dad, she says, frowning, what do you think I've been doing all day? She lowers the clear lidded box, walks to the den, and returns with a dozen pages of whiptail lizard information she's gathered off the internet. It's a western whiptail lizard, she announces, eyes flitting between the sheets of paper, or maybe a New Mexico whiptail, since the stripes are so bright. I nod and encourage her to tell me what they eat. Bugs, Dad, what do you think? Which is her way of saying, would you quit asking me stupid questions so we can get going? I say. Maybe rocks and flower pots, and let's see, small children? I grab her wrist and start gnawing on it. She giggles for a moment, but then straightens up. There are serious matters at hand, and she crosses her arms. Okay, anything else we need to know? I ask. I did see something weird, but I don't know what it means. What's this? She points to a page she pulls from the middle of the collection to the word parthenogenesis. Sounds familiar, I tell her, and it does, but I must read the full passage to take in its meaning. In 15 of the whiptail species, there are no males, it begins. They reproduce without fertilization, a process known as parthenogenesis, or virgin birth. Parthenogenesis is well known in lower animals, such as aphids, bees, and daphnia, but it is rare in vertebrates. From my copy of the Natural History of the Sonoran Desert, I then read aloud, in Arizona, approximately 60% of whiptail species are parthenogenetic, meaning that they reproduce asexually. The species consist entirely of genetically identical females that lay unfertilized eggs, creating a population of clones. Oddly enough, many of the behaviors exhibited by sexually reproducing species are expressed by these parthenogenetic lizards. Females will engage in pseudocopulation and mount and bite other females. Apparently, this triggers hormonal changes necessary for ovulation and egg laying. Well, I hadn't intended for this conversation to morph from lizards to the birds and the bees, so when she asks me what pseudocopulation is, I look at my watch and say, we'd better get going. Now she stalls until I tell her that a girl lizard pretends she's a boy lizard to encourage mating that isn't really mating to fertilize the eggs. Dad, she says, that's just gross. Because I don't have to further explain, and because she's already in 5th grade, when some might not think that copulation of any kind is so vulgar, I'm relieved. All right, I'm going to fast forward, talk a little bit about the importance of wildlife and community, etc., blah, blah, blah. Okay, now we get into it. Each spring, wind tumbles down the Rincon Mountains, through a valley stitched by the Pantano Wash, and into our neighborhood. It is a good season for flying kites, and on this last week of spring, Annalise, Juliet, and I weave a path to a wide park, naming cardinal and pyroluxia, desert hare, and tiger swallowtail along the way. The kites my daughters curl on the afternoon's high winds shine like windows against the endless blue dome of the sky. The window's thin panes are battered, then released. The strings tighten, then slacken, and tighten again. On the second afternoon, our friend Lynn and her daughter Amelia join us. Amelia skips and then stops, jumps and then dives in an attempt at synchronizing herself to the kites. Lynn brought the 5-year-old's kite, but the twine is tangled, and our best efforts to straighten the stubborn string are no good. Regardless, Amelia, who is not much bigger than a kite, perhaps nearly as light, squeals and laughs. It's not long before Juliet joins her, and together they race across the low grass field, while Annalise and I maneuver the kites, without expertise, yet with a certain grace. On the third afternoon, we cannot return, but other kites snake through the air. Amelia, delighted, can see them from her front yard, with its low stucco wall and wrought iron gate that fronts a meandering path not far from the park. She calls to her mom that she's going to see Juliet and Annalise. They're flying kites, she yells, beaming. Eyes locked on the colorful tails trailing from what must look like paper diamonds, she swings the gate wide and slides onto the path. In an instant, something is wrong. Her eyes drop to the ground. to the sharp pain in her sandaled toe as a young rattlesnake cocks back its diamond-shaped head to strike again. She jumps back and screams, terrified. She runs into the house, still screaming. She launches herself into her mother's unexpecting arms. Lynn and Gail cannot calm their tiny daughter for minutes. To Amelia, it feels like hours. Once her parents see the 2 puncture marks on the already swollen toe, they rush into action. Lynn dials 911, and the operator says to wait for the paramedics, who arrive in less time than it took for Amelia to relate what happened. Gail, meanwhile, grabs a flat-ended shovel from the garage and, already in her work boots, moves swiftly to the gate. She finds the snake curled and agitated, its 2-bead tail buzzing. In a flash, it is uncurled and headless, its tail still vibrating. She scoops up the limp body and head and places them in a plastic bag. She drops that inside a canvas bag, then inside another for good measure. When the paramedics arrive, they identify the parts as a Western Diamondback and know which antivenom to provide. Still, they rush Amelia to the hospital. Her adrenaline is pumping so that the toxin in her toe, the tissue already dying, does not yet hurt like it will. She requires 18 vials of antivenom over the next 2 days and even more on subsequent doctor visits. And now I'm going to fast forward to the last section of the essay. It is afternoon, and I have just returned to my office from a meeting. I check my phone and find 2 new voicemails. What greets me on the other end is hysteria. Between sobs, Annalise chokes out a few words: lizard, holding, blood, but no more. I call my wife, who's not at home but has talked to her older daughter. Annalise thinks she has killed Squeaky. When I finally arrive at the house, a neighbor and her daughter are also there, trying to console Annalise. As I open the door, she lunges at me. Her thick, sandy hair is a mess, eyes red and agonized. She explains, barely more audible than her phone messages, that she was trying to grab the small lizard from its terrarium, but it was running from her. She had to strike fast to catch it. When she brought it out, between the clenched fingers of her hand, she noticed a line of red around its jaw. She opened her hand as usual to let Squeaky climb up her arm, but the lizard didn't move. She prodded it with her finger, gently touching the striped back. Nothing. Then fear and horror and guilt consumed her, and, hand shaking, she placed the lizard on the basking stone to warm it up, to give it some last incentive to move, to end the frightening charade of death. Now she takes my hand. She holds it lightly, as if any pressure would break the lizard-length bones of my finger, like, she realizes, she has broken the body of the whiptail. She leads me to the terrarium, which rests on the back of the craft table in our dining room, beneath the window that looks out onto the porch in the front yard. In the yard, a palo blanco sways in the breeze, while an acacia, bright green in the slanting afternoon light, hosts a nest started by cactus wrens, completed last year by curve-bill thrashers, and used this year by ground doves. Acosta's hummingbird visits the scarlet-necked autumn sage before rising to dark gnats. Beneath the enormous blue agave, a lizard scurries over a rock to find a plump cricket, too slow, now gone. I place my hand into the box, and as my fingers approach the stone, I feel its radiance. The few remaining fruit flies cannot fly out, but that doesn't stop them from jumping onto my arm. I brush them off and pick up the lizard, which does not move. I lift my hand from the tank, close the lid, and examine the reptile. Already the eyes are sinking and have no gleam. The jaw is locked in a thin red smile. Squeaky is dead, I tell my daughter. She takes the body from my hand, face full of new tears, and rushes outside to the corner of the backyard, to the small garden plot she and her sister maintain, to the very corner of the plot. She digs a hole with her hand and lays the lizard in it, fills the hole and tamps the dark soil around the body. She says an indiscernible message or prayer and looks as forlorn as I've ever seen her. I watch Annalise from the back door and wait for her to come in. When she does, I hug her and do not let go for nearly a minute. She does not struggle for escape. I do not want to tell her what she already knows, that love and desire can sometimes be suffocating things. There is no need either for the voice on high to speak of responsibility and lessons learned. Instead, I take her by the hand and lead her to the front door, though we do not open it. I am searching for the right words when the parallel between the death of the whiptail and the rattlesnake bite occurs to me. No community is without its perils. We strive for acceptance and inclusion, but encounter misunderstandings and mishaps. A girl kills a lizard. Another girl is nearly killed by a rattlesnake. Neither action is intended, both arguably avoidable. But in the larger scheme of community, these are the outcomes of risks worth taking because the interaction and belonging of community are intrinsic. We cannot live outside of community, whether harvester ant or human. And community is not true without the sum of all species. Thank you.
Thank you, Simmons, for those wonderful words of community and love and recovery. Much appreciated. Our next reader is going to be Rachel Richardson. Rachel's most recent book is Smother, just out from Norton on February 18th in 2025. Matthew Zapruder says of this book, how harrowing, how moving, how oddly comforting to read these casually masterful poems. No matter how great the fear, this poet finds the courage to make poetry within and out of the great perils of our time. 5 of those poems were first published in Terrain.org. She's also the author of 2 earlier poetry collections, Copperhead and 100-Year Wave. She's the co-founder of Left Margin Lit, as well as a former Stegner and NEA Fellow. Her poems have appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, the Yale Review, APR, and elsewhere. In 2024, she was named an inaugural Artists in Fire resident through the Confluence Lab and is now trained as an FF2 wildland fighter. Please welcome Rachel Richardson. Rachel, will you read to us?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm not a wildland fighter, but I'm a wildland firefighter. I love the wildlands, and that seemed like the most exciting artistic opportunity to bring itself to me in many years. So I took it last year, and it's sort of the coda to this book. So my book, Smother, is about parenting with wildfire, parenting under the smoke of wildfire. I live in Berkeley, California. So my own house is probably not directly at risk. I live in the flatlands, not by the by our sort of our wildlands up in the hills, but we're still all affected, and the smoke comes and stays and hangs in the Bay Area very often from the other fires that are in our mountains or up north of us. And so we have felt that sort of secondary effect for weeks and months around these mega fires that we've had for the last 7 or 8 years. So that's sort of what became the subject of my book without intentionally being it. I had tried to write about other things like parenting without wildfire, or technology, or the loss of a friend of mine to cancer. And in every iteration of those poems, every image, the smoke kept recurring. So it became a theme. And finally, I sort of leaned into it and thought, well, this is how we mark time now in parenting. How old was my child when this fire happened? And how old were my children in the pandemic, right? These are the kinds of crises that tell us where we were and what was happening at those moments of our growth too. So I'll start with a poem called Creek Fire, which appeared in Terrain.org. And if you are from the Bay Area or were paying attention to the newspapers on September 9th, 2020, you might remember seeing these images of, or seeing them in real life, of an orange sky that never got light. We had this one day that is sort of known in forever as the Orange Day. It was really ominous, and I think it changed a lot of people's sense of the crisis that we were in. Creek fire. The dark comes in on my girl's 10th birthday. Fire bearing crow feathers. No, ash. It comes with its big breath, sun without light. Cold morning in the surrounding counties, everyone blinking, looking around, phones lifted to the horizon. So I'm going to dovetail with you, Simmons, and say I've got a lot of poems about kids wanting pets from the wild. And this is a poem called Domestic, which also has a couple of nods to my poetry forebears, Robert Frost and Elizabeth Bishop, who, one of the comforts of adult life as a writer is to have these voices of beautiful writers that just stay in your head from those things that you learned early on, and they come back to you in moments of sadness and isolation. And I found that a lot in parenthood and in the pandemic and times like that. They would just come and assert or remind me that they had these experiences too, and they knew how to talk about it. They found words for it. Domestic. Yesterday, as he was hacking down the passion flower vine, my husband, whom I directed to do this, brutal creature that I have become, destroyer of the purple spiked flower and the fritillary's nectar, who put the power whacker in his hands, its handle bright orange so that it could not get lost in the weeds, its toothed blades, heft of gas power in the palm. Yesterday, as he was doing my bidding on a ladder against the house, gently pulling, then buzzing one tendril after another, there was a sudden cry. Not Frost's rueful laugh, not Bishop's oh of pain, but the high clucking trill of a mother squirrel as two pink bodies tumbled to the dirt. In the tangle of shorn vines, they wriggled and squeaked, hairless, blind, shining as if oiled, as the hidden mother scolded, or so it sounded, even at her most desperate, trilling the repeating alarm. And my husband staggered back from them, hand over mouth, then retreated inside and returned with a box. And I, at my great distance, trowel poised over the blueberry pots, thought of telling him to keep it quiet so the kids wouldn't hear and angle for a pet. I thought of having to bottle feed the things now that they'd have our human smell, of driving them in crosstown traffic to the wildlife rescue, of the inconvenience of their living. While my husband scooped them up in his gentle hands, then climbed the ladder with the box and set them back behind the green curtain of vine, in with the torn warrior's flag they'd made for a bed, up against the warm wall of our house, in the nest for the mother to take them back, and then waited to see if she would have them. In a similar vein, this poem is called Fishbowl. 2 weeks after the ordeal with the goldfish, choosing the exact pair the kids wanted and netting them among their school at the shopping center's Petco, and bagging and buying them and bringing them home and letting the water sit, then naming them and pouring them into this world we'd made, then burying one, Fiona, in the yard with full ceremony and replacing her, Fiona too, and choosing the glittery blue rocks to amuse them so that their lives wouldn't be only about circling the tiny bowl on our dining room table, but circling the tiny bowl looking at something beautiful. That's when the kids give them up. Playing God or mother, giver of food and light, maker of beauty, has dulled. And so the fish, like orange flames, drift unnoticed within the contours of their sphere. When I think of it, I pinch flakes into their bowl, while over the crest of hills, smoke wafts toward us, and opening the door of our own glassed enclosure brings the smell of campfire, which is the burning of houses, hotels, and suburban trees 50 miles north. It's an old story, a fable we're learning to tell. Another fall, another fire. Monitor the air quality sites, switch on the purifiers, fill the bottles with water, leave the inhaler by the bed, pray to the gods of wind. Our bags are packed, though we know this isn't our fire. But the fire that comes for us may first send its white ash to cover our lawn like a veil, or may wake us with its hot rasp already at our necks. I think how the fire will take them, the roar that will fill the rooms we humans have surrendered and burst this little globe in an explosion of sparks. How relentless the holiness, the cataclysms. The goldfish may actually have a memory, contrary to previous belief, but the science suggests it's cinematic and at most 2 seconds in length, like a slideshow. Glint of dyed ultramarine pebbles, light bending through convex glass, flash of tail, jostle of waves, as the blurred figure bumps the table, skipping past. I think I will read you a short section of my longest poem, or my central poem, the title poem in this collection, Smother. I have felt in motherhood, and maybe particularly during the pandemic, when we had very little sort of support for parenting anywhere, because we had no school for 14 months, among other things. And I have felt that the position of being a mother societally is one that is, I have conflict with. Being a mother to my own children is not something I have conflict with, but the sort of societal expectation of mothers and motherhood, and these images of sort of the perfect mother, the ideal mother, the mother who is available for everything but needs no credit. That has always bugged me, and the ways that society sort of reflects images of the mother. So I started writing a poem in which I kind of made fun of it and talked back to it. That's my sort of nemesis mother. And it also became an image of the smoke at the same time. So I sort of personify the smoke as a mother here in this poem. And it's long, so I'll just read a couple of sections of it and see how they go together on their own. All right. Smother. The smoke never appears in family pictures. The smoke got up this morning and ran a marathon. She came in first in her age group without trying. The smoke's children are fine just where they should be on the growth chart. She lets their father cut their hair. The smoke writes her novels in the bath. She's cool with school lunch. Her Twitter is a thing of beauty. Her kids are her inspiration. The smoke cherishes each moment. She doesn't nag about people leaving the lights on. She just steps over the shoes by the door. The smoke is a statue. She's the life of the party. The smoke gets it all done and is happily exhausted in the evening. She can laugh at that joke, exhausted. The smoke didn't have to leave home to write about it. And what about the epics? She exhales. The smoke has an inner life, but it's the same as her outer life. The smoke is a natural consequence. She is awake to the mountains fleshed with trees, the houses made of boards. Her fingers feel for entry. She knows how to warp and curl. She knows warp and curl are the only movements on earth. Straight lines are the fantasy of your kind. She goes high and low, circumvents your brace and bolt, your Simpson ties, your love for naming things after yourselves, as if this binds your little dwellings to earth. But earth is soil. The worms carry it. Earth is rock and gas, which churn. The smoke loves her mother. She doesn't slink around looking for credit for each little favor she performs. She doesn't demand to be treated like a professional whilst eating Cheetos in her sweatpants on Zoom. The smoke doesn't sit with her feelings. Air or no air, she grows. So I had a lot of fun allowing the smoke to sort of be everywhere and come into lots of my poems, because that's how it feels. It's sort of invisible, or it's not concrete, but it can get into anything and be everywhere at once. And when you see like the graphics of how the smoke moves from the fire to all across the sort of air currents, you can see how it goes everywhere across the earth. which is both fascinating and beautiful and terrifying, and reminds us that, you know, these things affect all of us, right? It's not just the burning, the disaster happening over here. That's not my problem, but, you know, we're all breathing it. So another sort of game I played with myself poetry prompt I gave myself was to think about how smoke, you know, permeates, and find a way to do that in a poem. And so I decided to write Acento, which is a poem that is a collage of poems by other people, or sorry, lines of poems by other people. And what I did was take canonical poems that hopefully you recognize a lot of these lines and trade out their nouns for the word smoke. So this is the result, Smoke Cento. The smoke wades through black jade. Smoke knows why the caged bird sings. Everyone forgets the smoke also flew. The smoke too sings America. The smoke is elegy to what it signifies. Smoke is the thing with feathers. The smoke loved the earth so much she wanted to stay forever. The smoke diverged in a yellow wood. Smoke kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow. But I know too that the smoke is involved in what I know. And I will end with this poem. It's called After Fire, and it's about a project to rebuild a summer camp property that the city of Berkeley owns in near Yosemite in Tuolumne County. It burned in the rim fire in 2013, and it took 8 years to rebuild. This is 98 tent cabins and a big sort of central rec hall. And it was a place that Berkeley families and other Bay Area families had been coming for nearly 100 years. So it was sort of a site of childhood and play and communion with the wilderness. And it was kind of lost for one generation of kids, but we just got it back. They rebuilt it, and my kids were able to go to it in the last couple of years. And me too, it was a family camp. So the year before they reopened it, they invited the community around Berkeley to come up and plant trees with them. And so this is a poem about that experience. After Fire. The kids cradled baby trees in their arms, plastic conical pots with the starts of incense cedars and ponderosas sprouting upward, tiny shivers of needles spurting from thin beginnings of branch. And we trudged up the hillside with paper packets of nutrients, tree tea, stuffed in our jeans pockets to toss into the planting holes. The rains were coming. Everything felt lucky. We shuddered in the cold, clear air like saplings, our fingers numbing in flimsy garden gloves. The camp's engineer shouted instructions to our assembled group, spaced them 6 feet apart all over the hill. To feed the roots, scavenge for biochar left from the burn. Mulch them in a blanket of leaves to protect from the early snows. The kids carried trowels. We parents dug and pierced orange flags into the dirt at the planting sites to mark our labor, the starts of new sprouts, this imagined shade for our children's children. We stood over them, mothers over young, gods for our brief moment, remembering the engineer had said it's reasonable to hope that a few might make it. Thanks.
Thank you for that wonderful reading. Stunning, stunning poems. Thank you very much. Our next reader this evening is Juan Morales. He is the son of an Ecuadorian mother and a Puerto Rican father. He is the author of 3 poetry collections, including The Handyman's Guide to End Times, winner of the 2019 International Latino Book Award. Recent poems have appeared in Crazy Horse, The Laurel Review, Collateral, Salamander, Pank, Breakbeats Volume 4, LatiNEXT, and Poetry. He is a CantoMundo Fellow, a Macondo Fellow, the editor and publisher of Pilgrimage Press, and a professor and department chair of English and World Languages at Colorado State University in Pueblo. His newest book, Dream of the Bird Tattoo, Poems and Sueñitos, was published on February 18th, the same day as Rachel's. Sean Prentice says that in this book, Morales has created a stunning memoir in poems about his father's death and the grief that follows. This collection is honest, powerful, and heartbreaking. Juan, will you please read to us?
Absolutely, Elizabeth. All right. Hey friends, great to see you. Thanks to Elizabeth, Simmons, Derek, and all of the other beautiful terrain.org folks that are on this Zoom. Because it is truly a rich community that does so much for the written word. And I'm grateful to have had poems in terrain as well. And one of my poems I'll be reading today is also has appeared in terrain. Small update on the bio. I am no longer at Colorado State University Pueblo. I'm in my second semester as an assistant professor at Colorado College, and it's pretty cool.
My apologies, Juan.
Oh,
My
it's all good.
apologies.
It's all good. I have a lot of love for CSU Pueblo as well. And I still live in Pueblo, so it's all good. So speaking of all good, I'm gonna read you some poems from this new collection. Oh, the blur is doing its thing. Oh, there you go. So this is called Dream of the Bird Tattoo, and it's a collection of poems about my father's passing. He passed away on February 2nd, 2019. So it's been about 6 years, and so I decided to write a bunch of depressing poems about my father. And then as I was writing this book, I noticed that my dad's energy, his spirit was not really in it because he was a funny, scary, awesome dude. So I'm gonna read you some. I'll read you some sad stuff. I'll read you some awesome stuff, and I'll read you some funny stuff because I think grief is kind of connecting to those varying emotions and waves of aspects as well. And also, there's some weird dream poems here as well. So if you're playing the home version of it with the book, you may notice that all the dream poems are prose poems, and all the poems in real life are in verse. So I'll start with the first poem. It's called Of Avocados. Like two hands pressed together, they are twice as large on the island. One feeds the family meal, sending us to wonder, why are they so small stateside? On our last visit to PR, we sat on my tio's patio to talk and drink cafecitos. My dad stared down the giant tree burdened with dark green fruits. He didn't, his brother didn't offer him a single one. My tio died soon after. Dad kept bringing up the abundance his brother never offered, not as a grudge, but as a recollection of what we still couldn't get in the States, of what was delicious enough to keep all borders open. Within a year, within the year, two more of my dad's siblings passed away, and last week we lost him, a man who planned to return for one more avocado. For each of us, he would have peeled away craggy skin, parsed flesh, and held out those green wedges on knife's point. We would have accepted it as one last gift to savor. Snap, 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 snap. Cool. Um, so my Puerto Rican father, he also he also always gave me guayaberas. Do you guys know what a guayabera is? Like the cool Cuban shirt, but in this case it's Puerto Rican. So anyways, this poem's called Bury Me in a Guayabera. The shirts are a tradition. Dad handed me the mail order catalog and asked what I wanted. I declined polyester pants, but always humored him by picking a guayabera that would arrive 6 to 8 weeks later in a stuffed band envelope. I didn't wear them much until I was older, but I always felt safe knowing they hung in the closet. Pop wore polo shirts and khakis on his dark blue suit for church, So we always noticed when he broke out his guayaberas with pressed slacks and polished wingtips, reminding me how my sister used to always say he was way more fun when he was Catholic. Mom asked me to take whatever I wanted from my father's closet. I took 2 cans of shoe polish, a stack of handkerchiefs, and his 3 guayaberas. The 2 white ones with inlay I was too heavy to wear before, and a sky blue one, just like his eyes. And now I look to the mirror and admire each bold button, 2 embroidered stripes dancing down the chest like festive snakes, climbing over the pockets, ready for daily ceremonies that tell the world, bury me in a guayabera, shirt of my forebears, or better yet, dress me in this one, cremate me, and then spread me wherever I seemed most happy. All right. So I'm gonna, oh, snap, snap, snap. Thanks. So along with the personal journey and kind of exploration of grief and my thanks for being here, of my father. So there's like a few Puerto Rico political poems in here, and one of them appeared in Train.org, and in classic James Wright fashion, the title is almost as long as the poem. It's called 20,000 Pallets of Bottled Water Left Untouched in Storm-Ravaged Puerto Rico. September 20th, 2018. On a runway in Selva, under blue tarps pulled taut, FEMA's water shipment still sits 1 year after Maria. Against the backdrop of the people boiling river water, the agency apologizes for distribution issues, officials promising to test each bottle, though everyone knows it's as foul as their island supports. In the gaze of the aerial shots, pallet after pallet stretching out like a crumbled runway, the tallies of the dead jump from 64 to 3,000, and the mainland president tweets congratulations to all on a job well done. The island is a dry throat, a voice in the eye of the aftermath, hissing words unspoken elsewhere. Commonwealth, statehood, independence. All right, so for this next portion of our program, I have these like clever labels on my book, and there's a bunch of dream poems throughout this collection. I'm going to just play Dream Roulette and read you 3 random dream poems. And then based on time, one more, probably one more poem after that. So thanks for your time, your attention, and your energy. If you want to close your eyes for these, that's cool. Um, I'll save that one. Cool. Dream of hungry crabs. The old man stares into my childhood sandbox, reminiscing about the crabs he caught as a coastal child. Except he calls them cangrejos. He pops bananas open and lays the fruit out on the sand. I wonder how crabs could live so far from the sea, and he tells me to have a little faith. I am excited to break cangrejos open and to suck meat from their shells. When the crabs emerge, they are brown and wet, clicking joints. Their armored bodies and ravenous hunger terrify me. I feel their claws and legs like they're scraping pink abrasions onto my skin. They finish the feast, then scamper downward into the folds of sand. I ask the old man, how can we eat when we didn't catch a single crab? He laughs like the sea spitting out a whale, lipping one of the tiny holes with his big toe. He then asks, how can you still be hungry after that? Dream of the sun spirit. The landscape is an infinity of Japanese woodblocks, and when I look behind the sun and under one of its thick red rays, I find the globe-shaped creature. Like several animals spliced together and dipped into the color of lava flow, it animates its bird head to speak flames from opened beaks and eyes. Its body suggests cogs, sprockets, and ancient gears beneath. I can't see its legs, but its arms point and swim in the air. It nourishes the lush hills and valleys out of my reach. I blink too long and it vanishes back into the sun. When I describe what I saw to an old man that night, he scolds me for losing it before receiving the map of sunlight. I feel foolish and empty-handed until I remember the spirit still sauntering inside my head. Dream of acceptance. The woman from my past told me she had upsetting news. I braced myself, and she described how the EMTs who worked on my father learned from the mistakes they made on him. They learned how to decrease the blood pressure for someone who suffered a fall just like Pop's. The stranger would survive. I remained stoic, thanked her, and walked outside, ready for anger to overtake me. Instead, I stood in the forest with firs that rose higher than heaven, bathed in morning sunlight. It emanated white between the trunks, and I smiled because for a minute I felt my father alive again because of the stranger's survival. The light brightened and hummed all around until I couldn't see anything at all. Okay. All right. According to my calculations, yeah, I'm doing okay with time. I'm gonna read you. So in this book, I have this long poem, and in the early draft of this book, it was so depressing that my wife put down the book for 2 months and would not read and didn't read it. So she's a great editor, and that was a great lesson in kind of learning that there needs to be a little more emotional balance in the poetic journey of this book. So this one poem that I'm gonna share like like maybe three of these. I decided to kind of slice them and parse them throughout the book, and I think we've been on very good behavior tonight, but this is where I start to challenge that. I'm gonna start cussing here, so thanks for humoring me. You all seem okay with, okay, I think someone just left. I'm really sorry. No, they didn't leave. I'm just kidding. Um, thanks. I'll be here for another half an hour or so. So this poem, I'll just read. I'll probably read three or four of these because they're fun and they're quick. It's called "My Father's Blasphemy" or excerpts from shit my Puerto Rican father said. It is music that spits in the face of the church, adding shit, whores, leaving bread, and classic F-bombs. We know it better than any scripture. My sister's brother and I quote him with the same pauses and emphasis that taught us, you can't always hold compassion in your heart. Sometimes you must tell the insurance agent who just raised your premiums, I might be a little man, but I will stomp your ass all over this parking lot. My father's version of the talk happened when I was 17. I was driving, and I remembered the stretch of Cheyenne Mountain Road just before the movie theater and the shopping center. He turned and asked, do you know about sex? And I answered, yes. He concluded the conversation with, good, don't do it. He changed the subject back to silence, leaving me with what I needed to know. Okay, I'm gonna read this short one for Simmons and Rachel since they read pet stuff. Every time Mama would say, maybe we should get a dog, Dad would tell her, if you want a dog, I can bark. All right. Every time I called my parents, I eased into speaking Spanish with my mom for a while. I got comfortable. She taught me new words and she corrected me when I stumbled. When she passed the phone to my father and he greeted me with, what's up, Papo? And chit-chatted sports and talked to me in English. I asked him how he was feeling. He always answered, I'm cool, baby. I'm cool. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. If I see if you're at AWPLA, let's hang out. Let's celebrate terrain and stuff like that. And yeah, take care. Thanks.
Thank you, Juan, for the expansive reach of those poems and their emotional arc. Thank you very much. Um, gentle people, we have time for some discussion with the authors, Q&A. If anybody has a question or a comment and you'd like to put it in the chat, we can bring that forward. While you're pulling your thoughts together, can I pose a kind of a large overarching question to all three of you? Listening to you tonight, it seemed to me that all of these works seem to move between patience and urgency. Juan, you told us that you'd been working on these poems for years, that it had been years since your father's death. Simmons, I know that you've been working on this book for years. Rachel, you told us that while you were working on your book, it seemed to insist that you change your plans, and it kind of waited for you to catch up and change your focus. So, because it seems to me that in every day these days, most of us are jangling between the sense of the long haul and the sense of urgency, the need for a kind of patience and a kind of urgency. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about these kinds of energies and your work as a writer, maybe over the past several years and certainly in the present moment?
Well, I might say one part of it. I don't know if I have a full answer yet, but I love the word jangling. It does feel like this sort of hurtling between the urgency and grief, which is slower, right? Or just like watching, paying attention. There are some things that can't be sped up, and some things that we really don't want to speed up to end. So I find myself always feeling like I am jangling between those two emotions and those two ways of being in the world. And poetry kind of forces the slow one, right? Because the rest of the world moves so quickly and is so focused on, production and efficiency and, the news cycle or something. So I feel that as a sort of central, two sort of programs running at the same time or something, a central conflict. And maybe that's why I turn to the act of poetry to keep me in the slower time too, to keep me in reflective time and in like that very in the moment observational stance, as opposed to the kind of scroll of headlines and the like, feeling like the bombardment of time and news. I guess that's one of the ways that I feel it. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to get at in the poems too, because in my poems, I think you heard in some of them, there's a lot of technology in them. I sort of let the world be present and those influences in the poems. So I guess I'm trying to enact that feeling of strain between those two things.
I'll add a little bit. For me, it's almost a kind of a forced patience or a dissonance almost, because like in the essay that I read, gosh, the girls were little and they are big human adult people now. And that's a different thing, so if you work on a book, in my case, for nearly 2 decades, I guess the really interesting thing to me is to see how the essays have evolved since I wrote those initial pieces, and that is one of the earlier pieces that I wrote too. The last essay that I wrote is a braid that includes both personal and traumatic sort of landscape, or I should say personal landscape trauma, and introduces, really, I think almost for the first time in the essays, climate change, which obviously has been an issue, well, for 50 years at least, that we know. And but there is that sort of jangling in my place now too, between, okay, what I wrote maybe so many years ago and what that means to me now, and whether it's still relevant. And in revising the essays, I try to make it as relevant, not just to me, but sort of universal, as they say, as possible. But it is a truly interesting thing.
To add to this great question, and to riff with Rachel and Simmons. Um, I started a lot of these poems while my dad was alive, and also a lot of them were written like right when he passed away, and kind of being sick, and then also this book was like under contract for an extra long time because of the pandemic and so on and so forth. And so I had some fears and apprehensions that like having some distance from like the rawness of grief might kind of impact how the poems kind of came together. And but last week I was reading at Colorado College and I almost started ugly crying during my reading. So clearly grief, clearly like picking up the book, writing the poems and rereading them and stuff like that. It's very much like grief. It can kind of come, it can return at any moment. And I think that's like part of the I have to use the cool word too. It's part of the jangling between the different emotions. So yeah. And in some of the dream poems, I started writing these like when I was an undergrad. I was like, that was a really weird dream. So I want to preserve it. And I think a lot of you have experience with, because there's a lot of great writers here. A lot of you have a lot of experience where you write something and it just doesn't find its spot in the right collection, the right manuscript until like a decade or 4 years or whatever, and a lot of the dream poems were kind of like that. So yeah.
Well, thank you all three for those thoughts. Who else would like to raise a question or a comment?
Looks like Eric's got a question. You want to shoot it out there, Eric?
Are you saying I must speak? Okay, all of you authors out there, do you find any difference in magazine acceptances for poems that are humorous and poems that are serious?
Oh, sorry, Rachel.
No, go ahead. I want to hear what you say.
Fair enough. I think it's an interesting question because I always try to as I continue to submit I try to find places that are more susceptible or open to humor and fall flat, because we're all continuing to be very knowledgeable with rejection. I'm trying to I try to do that, but I think a lot of us have heard those cool different stories where someone finds a call for submissions like we don't take funny stuff, and then someone says like, well, I'm going to send you the funniest damn thing I got, and then it gets accepted. So
Mhm.
I think there should be some continued defiance in when you submit your work, because I'm anticipating a rejection or Derek's very thorough editorial notes on a terrain.org poem because they're just mwah. So
I love that. I would like to put on my CV like very knowledgeable about rejection. That's a good term, Juan. Yeah, I think we expect it a lot. It's the most likely outcome, right? Because we know that magazine editors get tons of so much more work than they can publish, and you all are doing heroic work in reading it all and finding what will work for your magazines. And I'm so grateful to have fit into the terrain.org conversation a few times. Okay, but as far as humorous, you said humorous versus serious. And I think that's an interesting thing in itself, because I was just thinking, well, I think my funniest poem in this book, and I really did try to lean into humor in this book because I really hadn't written what people would call funny poems before. But I think that's also my most serious poem in a way. So I don't know if I see those as separate things. I mean, if you're talking sort of light verse versus, humorous verse, like limericks versus, other kinds of poems, then maybe. But I think they can go together. I am finding it extremely fun to try to write funny poems lately, or to try to find the humor in the seriousness of our situation. And I'm also finding it extremely fun to write angry poems, because I think I was in a sort of, and I think a lot of poetry is kind of in a sort of like sorrowful beauty mode all the time, and or much of the time. And I don't know, there's a space for that, but I don't think it's the whole range of emotion that we want to be expressing in poems. And I have felt liberated from that recently. Or in the last 10 years or so, I have felt like I could really lean into anger and frustration and sort of righteous, rage. And that there was something generative to be gotten out of that creatively. So I've had a lot of fun doing that, and I found that those poems were publishable.
And I'll answer this, or try to answer it, from the editorial perspective, because I've written like 3 poems in the last 15 years. Boy, I love a good, funny, sarcastic, like, let's say, letter to America, right? I mean, some of those are the most resonant, powerful, spiteful, but in a brilliant kind of way, pieces. I think we need more of that, frankly, especially right now. I feel like we need more of that. I would wager that our acceptance rate of those versus serious poems is probably higher, because we just don't get a lot of those, really. So if you've got them out there, we're looking for them for our Letter to America series. Derek Sheffield can be talked with after this reading.
I was going to say almost exactly the same thing, Simmons, that it seems to me, and I've been reading a lot of those coming through for the Dear America series, that satire is alive and well. And it is extremely serious, but and powerfully so. But we also get some really, really funny poems doing that important political statement.
Yeah, I'm going to throw one in chat here that is a recent-ish Letter to America by Eric Moeller that is a menu, and it's terrific. But don't go leaving it just yet.
Thanks, Simmons, for putting that in the chat. And Derek is also adding in also tonally rich poems. So refusing the binary, right? Refusing the dichotomy there. There's a question for you, Rachel, here from Marissa Clark. Marissa, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
It's a little busy in my house I've got 2 parrots and a very busy puppy. And anyway, hello to all of you, and what a lovely reading. I'm sorry I came in a little bit late. Rachel, I was interested in your use of smoke as a motif in these poems, and I'm always thinking about manuscript collections and what might stay with me after I've got one book out, but after I put it out, it's like, oh, should I have put something else in, or how many extra poems? Or if you find yourself still haunted by the smoke motif, or finding it entering your work somehow.
That's such a good question, it feels to me like it's sort of, it's really a question about how do you shape a collection, right? Or how do you sort of determine the final parameters of what's in and what's out? Because obviously, yeah, it took me 8 years to write this book. I wrote a lot more poems than made it into the book. I wrote a lot more about smoke than made it into the book. But I don't feel haunted by anything that I left out. Once it was gone, it was clear to me that it should be gone. And I also have stopped writing about smoke, at least in that way. I have just had the opportunity to do this firefighting immersion program. And so I will now have sort of new material about smoke, maybe, and about fire, a new way of being with it. And working with it and seeing it. And so I'm hoping that there's like some sort of reprise of this work, some sort of other angle, but I think it's going to be very different. And I don't feel like I want to sort of go back and linger in the smoke kind of meditation anymore that I was in before. But the poems the lines that made up Smother, that middle poem, were actually that was sort of just notes I was taking over a couple of years. I got into this, I don't know, it was a pandemic and my kids were around always. And so I never really had a time or space to write. And so I would just sort of take notes on random note cards around there, scratch paper around the house. And it was in this very public space. So my kids were like interacting with my poems and throwing things away, you know, and like, or writing on them, adding to them. And so it felt like I had all this stuff that I didn't really realize was material until suddenly it sort of appeared to me as something that could be a voice. And actually the reason it did is because my daughter turned to me and read me one of my lines, and she, speaking of humor, she embodied it in this way that made it so melodramatic and funny. She turned to me and she says, "The smoke has no lover." And I thought, oh, it's a funny poem, right? I had thought that this was sort of, you know, probably a line I would throw away, but it was, you know, melodramatic and serious, but actually it's funny, right? It's a satire, I can work with it. And so I took all those collected lines, all that scattered material, and just sort of collaged it. I literally cut it up, put it all over the floor. And then everything that was outside of the group that eventually stayed just felt like excess, and I didn't need it anymore. So I think, I don't know, I guess to answer that question, I think my decisions felt fairly firm on what needed to be there and not pretty quickly, maybe in a way that they don't as often for individual poems, but on that subject, I felt like once I had said each thing about it, I didn't need to sort of linger.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate the work that you've taken on now that may change your relationship. So
thanks. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I want to be sort of a poet in the field, in a way, right? That's how we change what we see and change how we can respond to it.
Well, thank you for those thoughts and questions and remarks. Simmons, shall we call it an evening? Do you want to post a question to the fellow panelists?
I don't have any questions off the top of my head, although I'd love to sit here and talk all evening about pets and other critters, or as Brian Doyle said, children and other wild animals. I don't know, any other questions from the audience before we wrap up?
Yeah, there's one from John Price in the chat.
John Price. Sims, could you comment on the art of, wait a minute, I should ask John. John, ask that question.
Thanks, Simmons. I just wanted you to possible comment on the art of weaving research into personal narrative, which you do so beautifully. And it's such a challenge. I mean, I tend to lapse into the Wikipedia voice when I'm info dumping and I get caught up in the research. So you just, that piece in the chat, the book is beautiful. That chapter on beer is one of my favorites. And there are many others in there too, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thanks, John. I mean, it sounds like we can't really be talking about beer and alcohol anymore in this day and age, but that might be my favorite essay in the book. Anyway, so research, you know, I had the good fortune when I was in the MFA program, and even before that, I guess there were several inspirations for that for me from a nonfiction perspective. The first is David Quammen, who just writes such beautiful work, and while he's not a main character, certainly his narrative voice is almost like a main character in his work. And I think especially, and I've got them all sitting right here because I'm going to loan them to somebody, his Natural Acts books, you know, well, it was the column in Outside Magazine. I mean, you can't see that. But then sort of going back to the MFA program, reading people like Barbara Hurd's Entering the Stone and Sandra Steingraber's Having Faith, and how they wove really personal work with the research of whatever it may be. And obviously lots of Annie Dillard, I mean, you name it, lots of writers have done just amazing work that way. And I think kind of what you alluded to, John, it's not having huge blocks of that research that separates the personal story, at least in my part, and probably because I'm too impatient for that, both as a writer and reader. But I certainly do a ton of research and kind of have all those, you know, resources and see where it fits and what makes sense. But yeah, just so many wonderful nonfiction place-based writers to pull from for that, including you, my friend. All Is Leaf is a terrific essay collection that has research interwoven in many interesting ways, right? including the sort of field research, which Rachel mentioned. I mean, there's nothing like being out there in this place that we're writing about, even if you can only immerse yourself in it for a few days. It's so powerful.
Yeah, Rachel has a question too.
Question. Yeah, I've just been thinking about how we write about the environment and how we write about place, and it seems to me like it's becoming sort of a radical thing to do in a really important way. It also seems like we're trying to write about things that are happening to all of us and are sort of owned by everybody, like the fires are everybody's experience, or everybody in a certain community. And I'm just curious about how the two of you think about that sort of singular voice and the singular experience inside of the collective. Maybe particularly environmental questions, but anything you want to speak to.
Juan, I'm letting you answer this one first.
Okay, that's a great question and kind of a toughie. I think one of my default responses to questions of this sort is I always nag my students about the more specific we are, the more universal we become, because in the sense because I've noticed, like, in the sense of, like, even in this new book, I'm grieving the father, but I've had some thorough conversations with people that are like, well, I just lost my mother, I just lost my sister, and things like that. So and to kind of connect it to the environmental or the place-based aspects of your wonderful question. I also think of it as kind of like, I'm half Ecuadorian and half Puerto Rican, growing up in southern Colorado, which is, it was or is Mexico, however you want to put it today. Fight me. And so the loss of my father, and I felt like a really strong desire to write in his voice so we don't lose that voice, and I think that's kind of an urgency that has always kind of driven me, and I think it kind of becomes I would put it in parallel with kind of like writing, great nature writing in such great literary magazines as terrain.org, where you're writing about the loss of a species or a bird, and those types of aspects. And then I'll let Simmons riff with the question a little bit more, and then maybe you want to riff with us, Rachel.
Yeah, Juan, I think you're right. I mean, I think there is no collective without the personal, right? And it seems like right now, this world, at least our portion of it, is all about erasing the personal, all about erasing the individual. And I'm not saying that certainly we exist only as individuals, but all those voices, especially obviously the marginalized and underrepresented voices, now more than ever, are so critical. So we just can't tell or think about stories, I think, without them being, very personal. And then I'll also say in my own writing, the response, frankly, writing about my daughters, especially when I was doing a little more of that early on, was just way more popular than my other writing. So, not only my own personal voice, but their personal voices, I think, made a difference. Rachel, what is your response to that question?
Oh, now I have to answer it. I asked it because I want ideas. Well, I don't know what the overarching answer is. I mean, I totally agree with you, Juan, that like through the individual is the universal, right? And that the more specific we are, the more ability we have to connect. I also find motherhood to be in some ways like a very generic experience. I mean, not in every way. With my children, I feel like we are all individuals. We have our individual relationships, but there is a sort of like type, right? We have these, we're societally sort of told that we are a demographic or something. That's true in a lot of our identities, but in motherhood, I sort of felt that more strongly than I ever had before. And so there's a part of me that in my poems in this book just wanted to be like other people and wanted to connect with other mothers and to speak from the position of my experience and not so much my individuality. And so I think one of the things I ended up, one of the tools I used was the cento, just to sort of, which was actually less about mothering and more about the fires, but to sort of gather other voices to me, and ask to be in a conversation with them, or to keep them alive in a conversation that I wanted to be having about humanity and about our relationship to the earth, and about motherhood. And so that was a kind of delight for me to realize, like, oh, this is a tool of the collective. This is like an singular experience kind of form. And it was raucous and multivocal and fun, right? A way of having a party of other poets in the room. So that was one thing I found. I didn't know it when I was drawn to the form. It took me, working with it for a long time to realize, oh, that's why I'm doing it, because I want to have friends in the room. I want to have other voices with me. But that was one solution. But I love how everybody approaches it in these different ways, and I think that's one of the things that great writing does.
Wonderful thoughts. Rachel, can I make an observation? You said something maybe a third of the way into your reading about the focus on the domestic. And then pretty soon it sounded like you were absolutely refusing the kind of knee-jerk identification of the domestic with the nuclear family. And I was reminded of a few years ago, several years ago now, Orion magazine having a touring of the world as home, a number of writers who were saying the world as home, and going back to those kind of etymological roots of domus, and not just the house in which we're trapped in individuality, but getting into that larger sense of the world as home. And that's what I felt listening to your smoke poems, which I thought was just kind of surprising in a neat way.
Well, that's a really generous association, but I love what you're saying about that. Yeah, that is something I believe in, and I want to support and to bring into my world. Yeah, it's a beautiful way of thinking about home and family and domesticity, where we belong and how we belong to each other.
Lovely, how we belong to each other. I think that's a great place to wind up this evening. How we belong to each other and how we belong with each other.
Because we do. Yes.
Because we do. Juan, Rachel, Simmons, thank you for reading to us. Thank you, wonderful audience, and for sticking with us until the end.